For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise in this place in adjournment proceedings to pursue a question I asked just last week of the Minister of Fisheries. I have to say that the response from the Minister was so far from adequate, but I didn't expect to feel the rage I now feel in taking the question up again. The question last week was the Minister prepared to act on the Cohen Commission's recommendation number 19 to remove the toxic fish factories near the Discovery Islands as put forward in the Cohen Commission report. Now, I feel as though I'm experiencing deja vu all over again. I'm one of those people in this country who remembers the collapse of our cod stocks. I'm a maritimer. I remember the moment when it was really the large offshore dragger companies that declared the moratorium because the cod stocks were gone. In 1998, Michael Harris wrote the horrible narrative, the deep details of the corrupted science within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in his book, Lament for an Ocean. I read it and gave him a blurb for the back of the book, which was, after reading this book, I said I would not trust DFO with my aquarium. I didn't know that it was possible to be this angry again. I thought the Department of Fisheries and Oceans had begun to understand the notion of sustainability. But the Cohen Commission, which was at a cost of $25 million, commissioned by the previous government under Stephen Harper, looking at the collapse of salmon returns when in 2009 only 1.5 million sockeye returned on the Fraser, only 1.5 million salmon returned up the Fraser River, instead of the 5 million that were expected. Well, this year is the all-time low, a return of 270,000 salmon. First Nations up and down the Fraser, up and down the coast are declaring the collapse of Pacific salmon. It's a disaster. The Committee of Fisheries and Oceans was studying this very matter until prorogation pulled the plug on it. So when I asked the Minister if she was prepared to act by September 30th, which is the deadline, she said several steps were underway. I did not know those steps would be fiction from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Once again, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is cooking their science. How? They issued it today to say the risk to salmon from those open toxic fish factories was a minimal risk. No need to close them down in the Discovery Islands. And the Minister has launched a consultation with some of the First Nations involved, but not all, of course. Now, how is it possible the Department of Fisheries and Oceans could say such a thing? In March of this year, DFO gave those salmon farms virtual permission for out-of-control sea lice. As a result, 99% of the 2020 juvenile sockeye migration through the Discovery Islands were found in 3 different academic studies to be infected at levels we know will reduce their survival. So how could it be that DFO now says it's low risk? Well, to quote marine biologist Dr. Alexandra Morton, quote, DFO did not assess the impact of sea lice, the most visible threat, close quote. So if you're going to study something and say, is this activity dangerous to salmon? Well, let's exclude the #1 cause of disease and danger to our wild salmon populations, the burgeoning sea lice. There's a reason that these companies in our waters, they're Norwegian-owned fish farms, but in Norway, they're moving to close containment. This Liberal government promised in its platform to end open-pen fish farms.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and Canadian Coast Guard.
Madam Speaker, when I was first appointed as the Parliamentary Secretary in 2017, I read the Cohen Commission report from front to back. As a person who came to this House to improve the lives and opportunities of future generations, the issue of wild salmon immediately spoke to me as an opportunity to contribute to something that mattered to many British Columbians. I spent time with stream keepers, First Nations, fishermen, nonprofits to better understand the potential impact of fish farms on wild salmon. I was happy to serve as the Parliamentary Secretary who worked on passing all 5 major environmental bills through this House from the previous Parliament. This included changes to the Fishery Act, which restored and fish habitat and created new modern safeguards. I acted to defend the Salmon Enhancement Program and advocated to get more funding into ecosystem restoration through programs like the Oceans Protection Plan, and more recently through the $142 million BC Salmon Fund. After a brief period in transport, I returned to my current position during a time when our salmon are facing their most historic crisis. My earliest days on the file were spent in First Nations territory and on the site of the Big Bar landslide. This devastating slide is putting further salmon at risk, and our government has made all possible investments to mitigate the effects of this natural disaster on wild salmon. I say this because I want that member and every member in this House to know, as well as British Columbians watching this at home, that wild Pacific salmon is a top priority of our government. In the last election campaign, we promised to transition away from open net pen finfish aquaculture on the BC coast, and the minister is committed to delivering on that promise. The minister took some steps in that direction by announcing today that we are committed to an area-based management approach to aquaculture, starting in the Discovery Islands. I know that the member and others in British Columbia were hopeful that the announcement today was going to be an announcement to immediately withdraw the net pens in the Discovery Islands. While this is well within the minister's control and power, there are a number of important factors that were not immediately considered when the recommendation was first drafted by Justice Cohen. The primary of which is our government's commitment to First Nations reconciliation and to the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. First Nation communities have rightfully acknowledged the urgency of the response to the Cohen recommendations, but have also been very clear that they cannot accept unilateral decisions on what happens in their territory. This is an opportunity to work together with all affected First Nations and stakeholders to build a better future for everyone, and that is exactly what our government is doing. In terms of determining the risk level posed by farms in the recommendation, DFO created a formal scientific assessment framework and conducted 9 scientifically peer-reviewed risk assessments on pathogens that are known to cause disease. Now, I want to be very specific here. We are a government that takes science seriously, and it is important for anyone listening or reading this speech to hear the entirety of what I'm about to say. For each of the 9 risk assessments, DFO found that each individual pathogen provided a minimal risk to the abundance and diversity of wild Fraser River sockeye salmon. Their assessment does not include further analysis of the cumulative risk of all 9 pathogens taken together, either independently or in conjunction with other cumulative risks on wild salmon, including sea lice, climate change, or overharvesting. We continue to build on our body of science and on our understanding of the marine environment. This includes how we manage aquaculture. So, while there still remains no direct smoking gun that I can point to today, I can say our government is committed to a precautionary approach and moving forward with a responsible transition from open net pen finfish aquaculture on the west coast of British Columbia. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Point of order, Madam Speaker.
I'm sorry, there's no point of order at this point in time, unless there's a technical problem. This is a late show.
I'd like to respond to the Parliamentary Secretary, Madam Speaker.
No, I'm sorry. This is a late show. It's not a debate. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Well, if there was a way to add insult to injury, I suppose it would be to invoke the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to block the very thing that First Nations throughout British Columbia are urging the minister to do, which is to act. Chief Judy Wilson of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs says, quote, when a department fails so miserably as DFO, it's time the federal government calls for reform. It's not working. Let's be very clear, the 9 pathogens studied by DFO in deciding there was minimum risk did not include sea lice. I'm sorry that the Parliamentary Secretary is willing to say this is a top priority for his government. It makes me wonder what could be worse. I guess we need to dig more graves for Canadians because COVID is our top priority. And if this is a top priority, if Pacific salmon is a top priority and they continue to allow sea lice to contaminate the wild salmon population, then they don't know what a priority looks like.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard.
Madam Speaker, the protection and restoration of wild Pacific salmon is a top priority of our government. It is why we have taken such strong and immediate action on passing environmental legislation, including the Fisheries Act, and why we've moved to protect 25% of our marine habitat by 2025. It's also why our government has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into habitat restoration and innovative programs like the $142 million BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. Our government is also committed to transitioning away from open net pen finfish aquaculture in BC and is moving forward on this file in a responsible way. Our approach must include meaningful consultations with local First Nations and communities, and preferably with an approach that is aligned with the government of British Columbia as well. The future of finfish aquaculture in British Columbia must be clean and sustainable and prioritize the health and abundance of wild Pacific salmon and the biodiversity of our marine ecosystem. I look forward to working with British Columbians, including First Nations, local communities, the province, that member, and all members of this House to find that responsible path forward. Our kids.
I'm sorry, the time is up.